Welcome to this current iteration of the Search Mastery Interest Group speaker series. For those of you who are familiar, we in the Search Mastery group explore the foundations and practice of search, including skills, education, and literacy. We have um, periodic speakers to talk to us on these topics, and today we're really lucky to have Jason Barron and Elizabeth Pineo, who are talking to us about a paper about techniques that they developed in a practice that they teach. And the name of this talk is Same Class, New Approach, Reimagining Gen AI in Writing Assignments. You can see that their bios are here on the screen. Professor Barron is a professor of the practice here at the University of Maryland Info College. Elizabeth is a Ph.D. candidate and an MLIS, and she has an MLIS. Um, so you can just take a moment to look at their bios there, and I'm sure they'll tell you a little bit more about their backgrounds as well. So with that, I am going to turn over the program to Elizabeth and Jason, and we're looking forward to hearing you. By the way, everybody, if you have Q&A, put them in the chat, and we will keep an eye on them and answer them at the appropriate time.
Great. Thanks so much, Marianne. Elizabeth and I are really happy to be here, be part of your terrific speaker series. Uh, and let me just take a moment here to share my screen. Let's see. I always ask Elizabeth to see if I can see this, but let me put it on here. Elizabeth, is that good?
It is.
Okay. So, um, I'm very privileged to have Elizabeth as my TA for the last several years in a class that we're going to describe here. Um, but let me start with this event, which is like Krakatoa. It is November 2022. Now, I've taught the class that I'm going to speak about on record scandals in 2022, and the point of this time together here is that I've learned something about ChatGPT in the classroom, and we're going to talk about it. It is something that's affecting us everywhere in education. But it's not just education. There really is, I can be sort of evangelistic on the point of AI, and there are two very different points of view going on uh, around us. One is that it's an inflection point, it's the biggest thing that's happened in the 21st century. It's also an existential threat, and not just in teaching, but across all of our lives. Um, however, and here, Gen AI tools in all sectors of society hailed as a seminal event um, by authors and saying if you're one of those people who learn how to work with computers, you had a good career. Similar turning point. The signal point of our talking here is my enthusiasm for AI, but with a cautionary note. And so, in my view, students need to develop critical thinking skills about AI to succeed in the marketplace. And you can see that coming out in articles, whatever. With respect to the classroom, there are any number of commentators you can find that say this is an existential threat to the way that classroom taught. Basically, starting with searching for information, doing background research, leading up to the writing of essays. So we have all of these different Gen AI. I will talk about ChatGPT because that's what we emphasize, but there's a range of Gen AI apps out there. About a year ago, this article making the point that there will be policies, but that whatever cheating is going on, as defined as cheating, it may be because students don't know really what the rules are in terms of instructor policies. And so I really am on a soapbox here today to say that every instructor should have a Gen AI policy for their classroom, and it should evolve with the technology. This article was just a few days ago in the New York Times, And again, emphasizing that there's been a sea change with respect to the way that instructors feel that they have to deal with AI. In this case, the article is talking about how essentially throughout a semester, not only in high school, but particularly in college, students are being asked to write essays in the classroom for every assignment rather than sort of take home assignments. And that's one way that instructors are dealing with it. Um, the article says that, hey, writing sessions, research, and a library carol, it's over. Take-home assignments are over because they can't be policed for integrity. Stop assigning them for instructors. And students and teachers not navigating out without clear guidance. There's cheating as a problem, but there's also this technology's promise. And that's what I'm about, the promise of the technology and how to have students engage in critical thinking with respect to the technology. One more piece by a very respected person, Clay Shirky at NYU, basically writing in the last year that this is a crisis caused by AI. And so the only solution that is being proposed by him is on a final exam having a blue book, very much like the blue books that I had in law school back in the 1970s, if you can believe it. Um, and we disagree. I'll let Elizabeth speak for herself during this webinar, but I strongly disagree that that's the only solution. I'm, there may be a time and place for classroom exercises replacing it, but we have a different approach that we implemented to deal with the fact that every student at the University of Maryland is well aware of ChatGPT and other Gen AI apps. So we have been on a journey, and the journey really took place from the old era of 2022 to 2024, and then something different that we did in the classroom in 2025. Now, my course that I designed, because I've been involved in record keeping controversies for 30 years as a lawyer prior to coming to University of Maryland. I was director of litigation at the National Archives. I was a Justice Department attorney. I dealt with cases involving White House email and others controversies about electronic records. So design this course where every week there's some person of interest who's been involved in a record-keeping scandal. And the big question for a gen ed course at this university, everyone has to have a big question. The big question is what has been the societal impact? Students have to think in a larger sense. They look at the controversy and then they draw lessons from it about how we can engage in reform in society, institutional reform, ethical frameworks. That's the bigger picture for every assignment. The first three modules of the course are about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and I can tell you that most students born in the 21st century have never heard of Daniel Ellsberg. They've heard of Richard Nixon, but they don't know the details of the Watergate tapes, and they may or may not have heard of Iran-Contra, but they certainly don't know about Oliver North destroying hard copies of Prof's notes and as an early user of computers trying to delete Prof's notes. So those are the first three modules, and after that, we go on to have an essay, which we will describe. The learning outcomes in these courses, in this course, I'm trying, this is from several, a half dozen bullets. But what I'm saying here is that we want to have students engage in all of the facets of these controversies, historical, political, legal, ethical, technological. And I actually have group assignments that each student is taking one facet of a controversy. We have 25 controversies that we divide the 100 students up into groups of four or whatever, and they work on it. So you can see that. And I emphasize scholarly sources. I want students to go look at a book, Daniel Ellsberg's memoir, which we have on the syllabus, or listen to a hearing on Watergate, or read Prof's notes, or whatever each week from Edward Snowden, from Julian Assange, whatever it is, primary source materials. And that's why I was sort of categorically opposed to using Gen AI as a first go-to place, because I want them to go to a primary source. Okay, the the guidelines at Maryland are certainly favorable to the use of Gen AI. And so the Teaching and Learning Center and other places have put out lots of good materials on the use of Gen AI for background research. And so this is a promise that the University of Maryland understands. More specifically, there is a default. Students should assume that the use of Gen AI tools to complete course assignments not allowed unless there is some kind of class policy. Now, my policy has evolved. So that's the guidance from the university. It leaves a lot of discretion to range a spectrum of instructors. This was my policy going into 2024, which was because of my focus on primary sources. I wanted, and because of the caution about software hallucinating, giving erroneous citations, whatever, I prohibited the use of Gen AI software, even for research purposes, obviously not for drafting of essays, but even for research. I wanted students to go out on the web and find stuff, both primary and secondary sources beyond the syllabus, every assignment. Go do your own research. And so that was my going to position. That's impossible. It's impossible to impose that today because every search one does on Google, just about, and certainly in natural language search, it's a query exercise, but even with keywords, you come up with an AI overview. And it would be unfair, in my view, to students to say, go research the web. And the first thing that comes up in a Google box is an AI overview, which one could run with. You don't have to go to ChatGPT, whatever. So that it was a cautionary note to me that I needed to pause and say something different and to think through how students were actually using. So in 2025, I added a learning outcome, which is critically examining the output of Gen AI. And we're going to talk about what we did in connection with individual written assignments. The first assignment, so going back to these three historical figures, I know this is a busy slide, but what I asked students to do in the last several years, but fall 2024, is say, hey, these three individuals, Ellsberg, Nixon, and North, what would they do in currently to do the same kind of things, which is to get out the Pentagon Papers from Rand, to audio, to record people in the Oval Office for whatever purposes Nixon wanted, writing a memoir or whatever, or North for essentially not communicating in an official channel. So that's what I wanted students to do in that first essay based on the three modules we covered. And we'll go back to how we approached it in 2025. Well, spoiler alert for the rest of this talk, 67 out of 100 students cheated on that first essay. They did not follow, they did not ignore ChatGPT and other Gen AI in terms of research, citations, or actual text writing in some cases. So that is a fail as far as I'm concerned. And it was a big red flag. And frankly, Elizabeth and I did a very diligent job of finding those 67, mostly Elizabeth finding the 67, but who knows about the other 33? Anyway, so that's the flag. There were two other assignments that we asked to flip the script. We're not going to go into those. One was the college admissions scandal with Felicity Huffman, Lori Loughlin, their children, others being arrested, spending time in jail. The questions I asked of students is, how would you justify the parents' actions? And tell me everything that was done wrong. They had to read an affidavit that was a source material and describe the cheating scandal, compare it with other cheating scandals in society. So a sports scandal or a politics scandal, whatever. So that's that. And then on the last final exam, there was one essay that really asked students to look for solutions for disinformation and from Q and from other sources since. So that was what the context of three assignments where we flipped the script. Okay. Elizabeth, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Hi, everyone. I am Elizabeth Pineo. My pronouns are she, her. And I am so incredibly glad to be here this morning. Thank you so much for having us. So Generally, our students did quite well on those reassignments, but the issue of students misusing GenAI came up, as Jason mentioned, on a surprisingly routine basis. So how did we know that students were misusing GenAI? In both semesters, we identified GenAI not with any fancy and infamously unreliable detector tools, but by hand. So at about the same time that we launched the assignment prompts, we would go to popular GenAI tools like ChatGPT, Gemini, and Perplexity. And we generated a few different versions of the assignments using a few different versions of the prompts. In fall 24, comparing the content of the generations to student submissions was generally enough to catch improper use of AI. But by fall 25, GenAI's content generation was much more advanced. So we relied much more on black and white things like citations. Checking citations against content was also helpful. So things like, did the sources they cite actually say the things they were claiming they did? We found a lot of hallucinated or misattributed quotations that way. Once we identified an assignment that used GenAI in a way inconsistent with our expectations, we conducted what we called our due process. And you can go ahead and advance the slide there. Our due process began with us identifying assignments in which students might have used GenAI in a way inconsistent with our expectations. I reached out to the students directly with an email telling them that we'd found some indicators that they had used GenAI along with specific examples of what we'd found. And then that student was given a choice. Either they could meet with me virtually through Zoom, we were an online class, or they could chat with me by email. Most students chose to meet with me virtually in 24, and most chose to chat by email in 25. So at that point, we had a conversation about how they had written their assignment. And then I wrote up a summary of our conversation for Jason. And then he made the final determination about how we were going to proceed. Usually there was some combination of a point penalty and a written admonition not to do it again. Some students admitted that they'd used GenAI while others didn't. Some didn't realize that they had used it, so we were able to treat those cases in particular as learning opportunities. In one particularly interesting case, a student was using the Microsoft Edge browser after they'd integrated GenAI into the main search bar without realizing that the update meant that they were now getting GenAI responses there instead of regular search results. So in all of those cases, though, we were able to resolve the issue in the classroom without going through the student conduct process. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. In 24, for the first essay assignment, and then 25 for the case study assignment, we also offered a 24-hour amnesty policy because the number of transgressions was so high. So the deal was send us an email telling us that they had used GenAI in a way inconsistent with our policy, and then we would grade their essay as it was, no penalty. For those who didn't reach out, we followed our standard procedure. And then next slide. And as you can see here, we have a table with a whole lot of numbers and columns. But this is the first in a series of breakdowns about the GenAI use we experienced in fall 24. But the key thing that I will draw your attention to there, if you'll do the circle version of the slide, is those columns 2 and 3, the numbers of students who used and didn't use GenAI on that first essay assignment. So column 2, those were students using GenAI, that being so high at 67 of 100 is what spawned this project in the first place. And we were shocked, really, to see that many students using GenAI in a way inconsistent with our expectations, especially after making those expectations so clear. And these were only cases that we could identify without a shadow of a doubt. So go ahead and advance the slide. For the 24 case study, we made it abundantly clear what our expectations were. And leading up to it, we also devoted a lot of class time to discussing the pitfalls of GenAI use for writing assignments. We kept talking about GenAI, how to create citations and the importance of them, those sorts of things as the semester went on. By the time the final, which was a series of short essays focused on QAnon and mis and disinformation, came around, I think word had gotten around that the professor and TA were taking this GenAI thing quite seriously. But if you'll advance the slide one more time, you will see that we had a nice drop in numbers of students using GenAI in a way inconsistent with our expectations as the semester went on. For the case study, that number was down to 22, and by the final, we were down to 4. And for the astute viewer, you will also notice that the numbers in the final columns only add up to 99 students. That is because we had one student drop the course between the case study and final. So during fall 24, we were spending hours each week going through 100 students' assignments with a fine-tooth comb, searching for GenAI misuse, and it just wasn't sustainable. For fall 25, we decided to flip the script, where in 24, we had completely disallowed GenAI use. We decided to actually encourage its use for fall 25. So next slide. For that fateful essay assignment, we took that original prompt for the essay assignment, and instead of giving it to the students to actually complete, we had the students feed that prompt into a GenAI. For this assignment, we used Chirp AI and see what it gave out. And then you can see the prompt here Jason described earlier, talking about Daniel Ellsberg, Richard Nixon, and Oliver North, asking students to compare and contrast their approaches, for lack of a better word, to hiding records when they did it and how they might do it today. So next slide.
Yeah, and students are copying this copy and paste, exactly what you see here, into Chirp AI on the first assignment.
All right, so we asked students also to turn in their assignments as Google Docs so that we could see the edit history. That gave us a fairly foolproof way to see who had truly written their papers and who hadn't. We did, however, encounter in a few memorable cases tools that could not only generate an essay, but also generate a Google Doc that looked like it had been written by hand in the edit history, which was a very interesting conundrum to face. Thankfully, it only came up in a few cases. And for the most part, though, that Google Doc showed us places where students had copy and pasted large amounts of text. So if they were just copy pasting a quotation in, that was fine, we didn't care. Or if they were, as Jason mentioned, pasting their conversations from the GenAIs in, that was also fine. But if they were pasting entire sentences, paragraphs, that sort of thing, we did care. And it also showed us where they were generating text and then editing it to make it maybe look a little more like they'd written it themselves, which was also really interesting to be able to find too. The key to this, though, was that students had to set their sharing permissions in their Google Docs to let us have edit permission, not viewer and not commenter. Otherwise, we couldn't actually see the edit history. So for the case study, which happened midway through the semester, that wasn't really a problem because we had time to resolve any cases where students hadn't turned that on. But for the final, when we were grading on a much tighter deadline, that was a much bigger problem. So thankfully, students were generally pretty responsive to emails from us saying, hey, we can't grade your final until you fix the sharing permissions. But it did introduce an extra potential failure point that isn't usually there during assignment submission. But asking them to put the original prompts into a GenAI gave us all more or less the same baseline narrative to work from with some minor variations. As time went on, those variations did get bigger as the GenAIs got more advanced. But asking them to engage in dialogue with those apps allowed them to develop their prompt engineering skills, which was also really important to us. So go ahead to the next slide. We also asked them to find deficiencies in the GenAI's outputs, so things like hallucinations, misquotation, factual or other errors, and any assertions that they found, well, unfounded. And then you can go to the next slide. We also asked them to focus on a few specific aspects of Chirp AI's output that we found were consistent across the generations it created, and that were particularly important to their learning goals for this assignment. So in this case, that was the types of technology Chirp AI was recommending and what it was choosing to include in its conclusion section. And then next slide. For later assignments, we moved away from Chirp AI. For the case study in 25, we had them use ChatGPT and Perplexity and then compare those outputs. And then for the final, they could use any GenAI of their choosing. They just had to include transcripts of any conversations they had with those tools in the Google Doc that they submitted to us so that we could review them. For the case study and final, we also asked them to engage in iterative prompting. So they were graded on the quality of their follow-up questions and prompts too. And then we reviewed the entirety of those transcripts while doing our version of the grading, portion of the grading. But overall, with that new approach, if you will advance that slide again, we saw a slightly different trend in fall 25 than we did in 24, and advance it one more time. For the first essay assignment, we saw 13 out of 100 use GenAI in a way not permitted that year. and then 28 out of 100 for the case study and 11 on the final. And you'll also notice here that our numbers generally stay below that threshold of all 24s, which was also an interesting thing to find. I speculate that it's at least in part due to our more proactive demonstration of the inadequacies of GenAI, which also helped to make the point, I think, that like we knew how these tools worked, and our saying that we would identify misuse of them was hopefully taken more seriously as a result. But I also think that students were just more familiar with GenAI tools by that point, so they were able to self-regulate a little better than in 24. But what we learned from that experience was that students were going to use GenAI, whether we wanted them to or not. And nothing more important, really, than policing their use of it was to teach them the skills of critical thinking and AI literacy. But doing that requires students to actually use GenAI. So if we can go to the next slide, this is our framework for having students critique GenAI responses. There are 4 categories. Category 1 asks students to find clear deficiencies, if there are any, in the AI response. So things like factual error, subject matter that is not relevant, hallucinations, miscitations, and attributions, that sort of stuff. Category 2 asks them to critically analyze the AI's text, things like superficiality or incompleteness in its response, date cutoffs, if there are any for a given tool, or any arguments left out. Category 3 asks them to supplement the AI's response with their own work. They could do that by doing things like reading extra materials, even a physical library, or write their own response to the Gen AIs. And then category 4 asks them to personally reflect on the exercise and to provide suggestions for how best to use AI generated sources in future assignments. And this is what we used while crafting our new versions of the assignments for fall 25. And this framework, I think, helped students engage with Gen AI outputs in a productive way. The students input their prompts, they read the outputs in detail, and then they critiqued what they found. And that allowed them to see the strengths and weaknesses of each response that they got from the Gen AI, and hopefully to use Gen AI more mindfully as the semester went on. And our fall 25 trend numbers, again, stayed pretty low and steady in a way that they didn't in 24, which I suspect has to have something to do with change in approach, right? But on the whole, I think this approach helps students to realize that they need to build things like those critical thinking skills and writing skills outside of the Gen AI tools so that they can use them more effectively. And I think it's fair to say, too, that we've enjoyed the intellectual challenge that AI has presented to our instruction. And we're now fairly confident in our ability to work with it productively. And this framework has helped us immensely. So our students seem to both enjoy and benefit from it on top of that, because that's what teaching's all about, right? Finding something that's pedagogically functional, but that also inspires students to enjoy learning and seek their own answers to new questions that arise. And it seems to help us and them do just that. So with all of that now said, I will turn it back over to Jason to add anything else there might be about the framework, and then to talk about how our students have responded to the change in approach between 24 and 25.
Right. So thanks for going through all of that. This protocol is in our Information Matters article for people to use or cite to. And let me go next slide. Well, so here's my overall take on learning outcomes here, in terms of improvement from the baseline of what was done before. First of all, very clearly that students were able to detect flaws in the material. Now, there weren't that many hallucinations in the way that the exercise was set up. I can, as an aside here, I can tell everyone, I'm a lawyer before coming here full time, that there are now 1,000 reported decisions of lawyers citing to hallucinated cases, fake citations, cases that don't exist. So, and getting sanctioned for it. I mean, this is a phenomenon in the world about hallucinations. We recognize it. We didn't see a tremendous amount of that, but we did see misquotations, misattributions, and faulty citations in some form. So there was the ability of students to detect, for the most part, flaws in the AI generated material, and that's good. Beyond that, um, they certainly detected superficialities in the material. So they improved on it by noticing that the bulletized points that are made, especially in Terp AI, but in ChatGPT 5 and um, in Perplexity and others, do not do the kind of scholarly job that we would expect, certainly at the graduate level, and even at the college level. And so I think they got it. And we forced them to get it by asking them to do further research. So that's point one. I think the exercise did help develop prompt skills. That's not what I'm teaching. We could do a whole course at this university on prompt engineering. Um, and I think it's important in terms of the post, BS degree, BA degree as to how to do prompts in the world because you're going to be expected to be cognizant and to be proficient at it. So there was that. And we did see a range of students, some very sophisticated and some doing a minimal job of asking one or more questions. Um, I really believe that almost universally, the quality of the essays improved by looking at GenAI's narrative to the original questions on each of these assignments and then doing further research. Um, it is certainly the case, and many of us instructors know that students wait to the last minute to complete their essays. And doing that at the last minute, writing whatever they write, um, doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of in-text citations of the kind that I wanted, and a table of references at the end. But yeah, but being forced to consider both what the Gen AI narrative is and doing your own research. I throughout the course urged students to start early and told them they can't do this exercise on the last day or the last evening before an 11:59 p.m. deadline. But the essays that I found, and Elizabeth, you can weigh in on this point. I'll stop for this third bullet here. I thought they were great. Um, at least better than what I had seen in prior years. Elizabeth, you've been TA for several years. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree entirely. I think they were doing more research. I think they were starting from a higher baseline, right? So I would definitely agree that they ended up more sophisticated in the end.
Um, and uh, reduced but not eliminated AI cheating. You all noted that there's still what we consider to be cheating. Elizabeth, I believe that the uptick in whatever we saw um, was mostly, not universally, but mostly because of AI generated citations that seem to be more pervasive, that the software allows it. Maybe you could speak to what the university policy is with respect to using citation generators versus what students did.
Yeah, so the students, I would say, generally speaking, those who were creating fake citations with Gen AI, um, those citations came up usually entirely hallucinated. Um, the we were catching those citations because those were black and white things that we could find, right? Especially by fall 25, the Gen AI apps had just gotten to be so good with their text generation that the citations, the black and white stuff was really the only way to catch them for sure. So the university doesn't have like a firm policy that says you may not use citation generators or something. But a lot of the common citation generators, especially if you just do a quick Google search for citation generator, that come up on that front page, are either AI powered at this point or have been purchased by a company that has changed them to be AI powered. And so you're not getting a really high quality citation from those services. The university library recommends Zotero, which is my personal preference, Mendeley and EndNote for citation management. And so we really encourage students to use those three because they require you manually to put in the information that you want in the citation. And then the app just puts stuff in the right order for you rather than Those AI ones that you might find with a quick Google search, pulling whatever information they can out of whatever web page you might feed them. You're going to get a much higher quality citation from those citation management apps than you would from the citation generators online. And that's what we tried to really help the students to understand about citations and the importance of citations. We also spent a lot more time talking about the importance of citations as like, what do they do and how do we give credit to authors that we're pulling ideas from, and that sort of stuff. So yeah, that is my piece on citations.
Um, and by the way, I'm looking at the questions in the chat. We're going to answer every one of them. But let's just go through just a couple of more slides and then we'll be done. Um, we asked students to reflect on what they found about the assignments. We did it at the beginning after the first essay. We did it as a final exam question to do a reflections. And overwhelmingly, students appreciate what occurred. They never had this kind of exercise before. Now, granted, many of the students, about a quarter of them are freshmen. They were sort of evenly distributed with a little bit more weighting towards freshmen and sophomores in this class. But students at all levels, they appreciated what's done and they understood something about Gen AI that they hadn't uh, really realized before. And so let me just see if I can do one more advance here. These are just some. I mean, we got 50 pages worth of material that I could put up here in terms of reflections on the piece. But they understood something that they hadn't understood before. And so I think that's an advance. Um, my view, and I'm a broken record on this, is that they need to deal with this in every place, in the legal profession, certainly, um, and in every discipline, there's going to be some encounter with an expectation of one's senior people to use some kind of AI software and Gen AI in particular to be more efficient in the job, whatever it is. Now, we can all wish for a different world where we're all producing all content, but AI generated content is pervasive out there, and one should be able to critically examine what is going on with it. So, with that, I'm going to go back to um, the comments. And Elizabeth, maybe you and I can alternate in taking the lead on responding to each of these or whatever. I will take the first one from that I see from Rebecca. So, have you considered using the term mistake or error instead of hallucination? I find hallucination misleading, as if Gen AI is just batty and not producing errors. Well, this is a term of art now in the world. So it's not Elizabeth and I using the term hallucination. I really would urge anyone viewing this to sort of look it up online. Maybe you can use ChatGPT to define what hallucination is. But it is a completely false citation to something. So a case, Smith v. Jones, that doesn't exist. Now, there are variations of that. You could have Smith v. Jones existing, but the the further citation to DC Circuit 2006 might be wrong. In any aspect of this, we find, and not just legal citations, but in any kind of academic citations, purely false references. That's a phenomenon that didn't occur before 2022. Students get wrong the citation forms, and they may misattributed quotations from one article to another. They're not generally before 2022 making up out of whole cloth a reference. So I think the term hallucination is a good one. It is the category mistake or error is a larger category. You could have a correct citation, but that the AI has generated a misquotation, has made up something um, in a quote that you use in a text. Um, and you can say that that's more like an error or mistake. Okay. let's go on. And Elizabeth, go take the lead on this, and then
All
I'll say
right.
whatever it is.
All right. So how much knowledge do students have before they start research and or using AI? And then follow-up question, do you give them reading that serves as a baseline? Um, so I would say it very much depends on the student and on which semester the class is being taught in. I would say most of our students come into class at this point having at least used a Gen AI app a couple of times. I think it would be really hard to find an undergrad at this point who hasn't. Um, do we give them readings? We give them content readings, like about the course content. We haven't given them readings about Gen AI itself, but we do that in class, like in lectures, so they get that information ahead of time anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot on the person. We have a lot of students coming in from all across the major, but a lot of them coming from a little more of a technical side of things, a little computer sciencey. So a lot of them, I feel like sometimes have more AI knowledge than I do, which is kind of fun to see too. But yeah.
Next question. Um, Julie asks, how do you navigate such assignments when a student expresses concern about using AI? For example, students who are morally opposed to using AI due to environmental concerns. This raises something that I have heard throughout the university, especially in discussions from instructors in gen ed courses, a global concern about the environmental harm caused by AI, not just gen AI, but I mean all uses of AI in huge server farms and um, taking an inordinate amount of electricity to other sources of power. I get it. Um, in my experience, no student has come forward to express these concerns. I think it's a valuable question. I think I will consider posing it to a class in the future. That if you do have moral concerns, talk to us, and then we will figure out it's a kind of a form of accommodation. I've never encountered a student with that. In fact, my experience is just the opposite, which is 100 out of 100, maybe not, but 98 out of 100 students in the course are using a form of Gen AI every day. And so I get it and I'm sympathetic, but it's not my real world experience. But I think you have asked a good question. I'm going to incorporate it. Um, do you teach them uh, how? Read this, Elizabeth, because I can't see the full
Yeah. Do
question.
you teach them how to detect a hallucinated response? So yes, hopefully, is the goal of having them respond to those Gen AI outputs with their own writing to have them look at it critically and find the things that are real, the things that are not, the things that are somewhere between real and not. So hopefully, yes, that's the goal of all of this. Um, and then I'll speak to that next question too. How did you handle grading students who you flagged as using Gen AI, but they denied that they used it? Um, that was always a very interesting conversation to have because generally speaking, by the time they got to having a conversation with me, um, we knew that there was something going on with their essay. We didn't ever call anybody in when we weren't certain that there was something wrong. There had to be something really black and white and concrete for us to pull them in. We weren't the gray cases we would let slide, really. Um, that sounds a little permissive, but yeah. So at
Right.
that point, if they were denying that they were using it, what it really came down to was, something like a citation. If the citation's not real, it's not real. And regardless of where it came from, under the university's policy, that's still a problem. And so we still had to address it as such. So it really just came down to, look, this is what's in your paper. And if you're not if the citation or the quotation or the attribution is off, it's off. And regardless of where it came from, that's the problem that we're addressing at this point. So that was generally how we got through those moments.
There are murky cases, there are clear cases. One of my favorite kinds of problems that come up is that you'll see a citation that has four authors in it, but the article is only by two authors, and then the article itself has references to other sources with other authors, and somehow the AI has mashed up four author names, only two of which are in the main article. And that's not a kind of mistake that a student would ever make. The larger point is that AI makes mistakes that humans don't. They make different kinds of mistakes in many cases. Um, I want to respond to this in one more way about Abigail's question, which is that I have not, in my 6 years of teaching at the University of Maryland, ever referred a student to the honor board. Um, I wish to take care of these problems that have come up with AI within our classroom. And there have been a couple of hard cases where I think reasonable instructors might disagree. Instructors might reasonably disagree as to whether an honors board referral is appropriate. But I believe that instructors and students can have a dialogue, and I can try my very best to, with Elizabeth's great help, to inform students of problems and try to resolve them going forward. And that's my teaching philosophy. And I respect that others might deal with it differently. Yes, the slides will be up. We're going to make sure one more round that they're Title II accessible. We will do that. Um, I believe I'll defer to Marianne on a recording, but I believe we certainly hope to have a recording of this put up publicly. Marianne, if you want to weigh in.
Yes, the session is being recorded and it will be on the Search Master YouTube channel, and there's a link in the chat.
So I'm glad there was the next question because I did have another slide, which is to make my point that there's no going back, that prompt engineering is really, really important. And so this is what we're trying to do. And as the question is, we have the article in this. If you just type in information matters in the same title as this webinar, you'll get it. But we have the link. And so that's there and it's in the chat and go on. And so we have another comment. I prefer hallucination error because it describes the situation more specifically. It's creating something new that does not exist. It would be an error if it stated something that existed but incorrectly. And I think that's basically right. I mean, at the margins, different people might have different definitions of what a hallucination is. And, as the technology goes forward, 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to have a much more robust set of thoughts in terms of uh, what are hallucinations. So, Elizabeth, go ahead on
Yeah, all right.
this point.
So do you have any recommendations to detect improper AI use for assignments that require few or no citations? For example, a written analysis of qualitative data that they've collected or a reflection on a theory. Absolutely. So essentially what we did to check the essays that we were receiving initially was to put our prompt into GenAIs that we thought students might use, and then just collect those responses that the GenAIs gave us and then compare the students' submissions to those responses. That general approach works for just about anything. Any prompt that you give a student, you can give to a GenAI. If you think that the students will be using GenAI, feed the GenAI the prompt and just see what it says so that you have a sense of what a GenAI response to that prompt might look like. Um, Citations are an easy giveaway because they're kind of black and white. But yeah, a lot of assignments don't have them. But for the example that you gave, a written analysis of qualitative data, GenAI is still going to very likely hallucinate and get things wrong. So if you know your data set really well, and you know that it didn't mention, I'm looking at a crocheted brown dragon. So, maybe you know that it didn't mention a crocheted brown dragon in it. Um, and the students up there reflecting on that lovely mention of the crocheted brown dragon, that's another form of hallucination. That would be another form of giveaway. But just looking for those things that they're right but not quite right, I have found to be really helpful. Again, things like reflections on a theory, GenAI loves to speak really certainly about things, right? So that doesn't mean that it's going to get things 100% right, particularly if you ask them. Oh, but you said no citations. I was going to say, particularly if you ask it to cite two sources, right? It loves to get those wrong. But if you're just having the student reflect on things, generally speaking, there's going to be something in there that's close to right, not quite right, maybe a little too advanced for the student or something along those lines. It's just a matter of getting familiar with what the GenAI might say and then being able to compare that to what the students are submitting.
Yes, there are outliers where the quality is so sophisticated, yeah, that a college student wouldn't be expected to have researched a point like a PhD. And so we get some of those cases. But let me answer the next question. So, how do students assess the answer they're getting from AI? Well, that takes some effort. My expectation is that if you ask ChatGPT to give references, that you're going to check those references. Um, it's regrettable that not every student put aside ChatGPT checks all their references. They get it from somewhere themselves online and then put references in that look good and don't check them. Lawyers do that too. They're not checking references, and academics as well. And so that's a phenomenon that's pre-ChatGPT, but it is very important to check the references that GenAI app is giving. As for fly-specking every sentence, every assertion, I understand that there are limits to one could expect of freshmen and through seniors in college. But my view is that the assignments as we've constructed them is to do your own research. And if you see something that's sort of superficial, as said, you're going to do your own research. And in many cases, you're going to see that there's something that was off in terms of an attribution to a famous person that just doesn't seem right. So, but citations are really the best way to be checking GenAI output. Marianne, you mentioned that work quality was improved after further research. How did the students conduct the further research? Well, this is search mastery. This has led me. Uh, this is a good question to come back to the beginning of this series, which is that we have been in an environment where, at one time in my life, I went to a library and looked up in Encyclopedia Britannica for background purposes. That was my search. Um, and then Wikipedia comes along in the 2000s, and that's a good resource to start with, although it's controversial. And I've had discussions with people about citing to Wikipedia articles. Um, and I generally am supportive of Wikipedia too, but you have to check things out. And and so, my idea here is that the emphasis in this course is to make students go to primary sources. So I ask them to include one or two primary sources in whatever essay they write. I admit that as time goes on, you can ask of GenAI to summarize what Daniel Ellsberg said in his memoir. So there is that. And you can certainly, it becomes an issue, but it is still, I think, something that students should be able to do, which is to search for primary and secondary sources. Go to Google Scholar. Not everything is digested in GenAI apps in a level of detail. And so I have high expectations. I'm a very easy grader, but I have high expectations that students will attempt to do their searches in an advanced way. Well, we have reached the end of questions. If there are any other questions, let us know. Otherwise,
There's one more question in the chat.
okay, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Did you notice differences in AI output for the exact same question and the same search tool across students? Do you want to answer this or do you want me to answer?
You go ahead and then
All
I'll
right.
say it.
So generally, it depended on the semester, it depended on the tool. And I'm guessing when you say search tool that you mean the AI tools. So that's how I answer the question. So early on, when we were first comparing GenAI outputs to what the students were submitting, I would say the variation was pretty low. You'd maybe get like 3 or 4 different versions of the same essay. You could really easily find like the same sentences, even the same paragraphs would show up across generations. It was really easy to spot things that way. As time went on, those variations got much larger, to the point now where you can't just compare sentences. You're not really going to get exactly the same sentence. You might get the same paragraph structure, you might get the same structure of the essay response, but you're not getting like a really obvious black and white, this is the same as that. Um, so at this point, I would say, generally speaking, you'll get something of similar structure, but not the same in response to the same question using the same search tool across the students. Um, Different tools have different amounts of variation. ChatGPT tends to have quite a lot of variation. Perplexity and then Gemini tend to have a little bit less variation. It kind of depends on how the student prompts them because like their default, they like to give out bullet points, right? And then it kind of seems to depend on how the student tells them to avoid the bullet points, like write it out in essay form instead. Um, what level of variation you get at that point. So that's a little more like depends on the prompt. But in general, at this point, yes, we do notice differences,
Yeah,
which is really interesting to see.
there are differences. There are subtle differences in with the same tool, the same app. Um, Obviously, if you don't put in provide references, you're going to get less references. But we also did one more thing in terms of our own back end work, which is we had an additional assistant uh, to the course assigned that I'm very thankful to have, and we asked him to look at a variety of Gen AI apps so that we as instructors knew what that variety could be. And so drawing from some other thing like Claude or whatever, Gemini, whatever, to at least have some kind of baseline to catch what's going on. And with that, um, we, and okay, there's another question. How often did you write the prompts for them? Um, I wrote no prompts for students. I don't think, Elizabeth, you wrote any prompts, but we expected students to um, come up with their own questions, and some did a very good job of not only one, but several questions. I must say to the audience here, which is that when I'm using one of these apps, I have a dialogue. And I find that if you have a sophisticated dialogue where you're asking questions and getting further and further along, you get richer answers. So I'm hoping that in the future, and I'm going to emphasize this, that we're really going to encourage students to have a dialogue that goes a number of iterations. Of course, that is a bigger burden on an instructor if we're going to have a Google Doc that has the entire thread of everything that they did. So there's limitations here. Um, Marianne, I'm going to turn it back to you. I really appreciate the opportunity for Elizabeth and I to present today.
Okay, I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. The content was really super. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. As we said in the Q&A, there will be a recording of this available on the YouTube channel, and Jason and Elizabeth have graciously offered to make the slides available to everybody as well. So we'll get those posted on our on the Search Mastery website. And I want to thank everybody who came to this presentation and to any of the others that we've had this academic year. We'll hopefully have another speaker series starting in the fall, and you'll all be on the distribution list for that. So thank you, Jason. Thank you, Elizabeth, for all the great content and answering all those interesting questions that people answered. And we look forward to seeing more work from you on this. So thanks, everybody.